Hi everyone, and welcome to week 4, the final week of our mini course on the history of medicine as part of the R1901 Postal Pensioners Shared Learning Project at the University of the Third Age. So the aims for this week, which is probably pretty self-evident by the title, is to help you guys better understand the various treatment options that would have been available to your postal pensioner. And really what this week is going to look at is not going to just look at the various treatment options that were becoming available in this period. New kind of therapeutic techniques and pharmaceutical drugs and so forth, partly because, this is a half an hour lecture and there were, a bewilderingly large range of different treatment options for a bewilderingly large number of diseases and conditions in this period, and I can't really cover them all. So whilst I'm going to be looking at some of the big kind of changes to approaches to treatment in this period, I'm also going to be paying a lot of attention to provisions. So thinking about, before the advent of the NHS, how people might have been able to access healthcare. And so the part 1, it's going to be a very broad overview, and I've called this part Places, Practitioners and Pills, partly because I love alliteration. But really what it's designed to do is to give you guys an overview of what historians have often called the mixed landscape of care in this period. So as I mentioned before the advent of the NHS, there were a multiplicity of different ways in which you could access medical treatment. And so I'm just going to be going through a few of the places where you could, who might have been treating you, and also around the turn of the century, so the time when your pensioner retired, what kind of new treatment options were becoming available for people. Okay, so we've got the places of healthcare here. I'm not going to go through each of these in turn. Some of these are going to be pretty self-evident, but I've divided it into hospitals, and I've also included in here asylums and sanatoria, the home and the workplace, and we're going to be looking at each of these in turn in this lecture. So for hospitals and other places here, I've got a little pound sign next to services you would have had to have paid for. So we've obviously got private hospitals. We also have the development of poor law infirmaries and also poor law dispensaries, so places where you could go and access medication in this period. Voluntary or charitable hospitals, where as a patient you wouldn't have been expected to pay, but oftentimes you would have had to be nominated by someone in order to receive treatment there. Asylums, both public and private. Private asylums have been around for a long time, the real growth of them in the 18th century. But from the middle of the 19th century onwards, it becomes a statutory requirement, as we'll cover, for local governments to build public asylums. And then sanatoria, which again, there are a lot of private sanatoria in this period that had been for quite a while. But again, in the opening decades of the 20th century, there is allowance made for people to have access to free care in the sanatorium, and also some public sanatoria to be built. And then we also have the place of the home, so family members who are often the first port of call for treatment. Private nursing, was an option, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. Also GP visits too. And then we've got the workplace, which was another site in which you could access healthcare. So you could do so through the Friendly Society or trade union doctor. I put a little pound there because whilst you wouldn't have had to have paid the doctor's fees, you would have obviously still had to be a member of these societies, and that involved paying a regular due. And then some places had on-site medical doctors or nurses. The post office had medical doctors at its disposal, and other places do too, not just civil service workplaces. There are private businesses too in this period that employed on-site medical staff. And then I've got the practitioners of healthcare, and again, just like the places of healthcare, this is a very large and very diverse taxonomy. So nursing's very interesting in this period. There's a lot of attempts by some within the nursing profession to really push for the professionalization of nursing, and as part of that, to introduce formal training requirements. And they are successful in doing this. But in the period we're talking about with your pensioners, there was still a very, very large number of people who were nurses who did not hold formal qualifications, who did not attend the nursing schools that are becoming increasingly popular in the latter decades of the 19th century. And, you could kind of see them everywhere. So in poor law nurses, you had private nurses, you had nurses who specialised in the asylum treatment and so on. And then you also had doctors, so you had general practitioners and family doctors who are much like the doctors we see today. So they're the first port of call in most instances, and they're the ones who refer you on to specialised hospital treatment. And then there are sick club and friendly society doctors, and these were generally general practitioners who would supplement their income by attending to workers or in friendly societies, or people in sick clubs, which are very similar to friendly societies, but weren't necessarily affiliated to a particular workplace. So you would pay a regular due, and it would provide insurance for you in times of sickness or ill health. Then there are the quack doctors, just like today. There are unscrupulous practitioners, perhaps, who would not hold a Doctor of Medicine, who wouldn't have had formal university training, who would have advertised their services in local papers or at county fairs. There was a lot of attempts in this in the 19th century and early 20th century to try and stamp out their practices by the medical establishment. They weren't ever entirely successful. And then we have medical officers of health and poor law doctors, so people who had a statutory requirement and were employed by local government to look after the health of a local population, and who would have had a Doctor of Medicine and probably would have gone on to do postgraduate training and gotten a public health diploma. And then we have surgeons who operate in the hospitals as consultants. It's worth saying that they weren't the only people who did surgery in this period. So a lot of general practitioners, especially in rural areas, would often perform surgery in smaller cottage hospitals. So, if you had a pensioner in a more rural area, don't necessarily think that they would have had to have travelled to a big metropolitan hospital for treatment, or that they would have necessarily been seen by someone who held a doctor of surgery. And this is the pills part of it. So I thought I'd just mention, some of the big landmarks in the kind of history of medicine in this period, in terms of a number of different things, really. So aspirin and Novocaine in the late 19th century. So before this, analgesics and anesthesia had very much so analgesics had focused a lot on it'd been slightly confined to opium and cocaine, and obviously there comes with that lots of substance abuse issues and other various things, complications. This is actually a very early example of an aspirin bottle produced by Wellcome and Company. So sorry, I just took a drink. The Wellcome, that is the Wellcome of the Wellcome Library, by the way. Early example of an aspirin bottle. Then in 1910 we have treatment for salvarsan, which is for syphilis, which is the first kind of specific medicine that targets infection, and it kind of opens the way for a lot of other chemotherapeutic treatment in this period, and it's seen as it's seen by contemporaries as a real step forward, in targeting infectious diseases and STIs especially. 1913, we get the development of an effective diphtheria vaccine. 1920s, the development of insulin in the treatment of diabetes. As we talked about in week 2, these kind of chronic non-communicable health conditions are becoming more and more important as we get an aging population. who are increasingly dying not from infectious disease, but from these degenerative conditions like diabetes. And then the 1920s and 30s, we get the kind of great discovery and treatment of diseases and conditions using vitamins. So addressing common nutritional deficiencies through vitamin treatment. Scurvy comes to mind, but there are others too. And so in this part, I'm going to look at the home as a space of healthcare. This I chose because it's hard to find a single picture that sort of encapsulates the great variety of different homes and that people lived in this period, right? Including your pensioners, we have a very diverse population of people who lived in rural areas and large towns and cities, and some who earned a pretty poor wage, some who earned quite a good one. So in the end, I ended up just concentrating on this one, which is from Arthur Cottage Museum in County Antrim. And I just liked it because it shows a kind of home that perhaps wasn't the most modern and up-to-date home of this period, but we had lots of people, especially in rural areas, living in these houses that had been around for centuries, essentially. So I just wanted to kind of make sure they were represented. So sickness in the household. So despite the growth in hospital provision in this period, and it was a great age for hospital building and a real age of optimism for what the hospital could do for the health of the public, home-based healthcare still really remained quite important, specifically for the upper classes who might not have necessarily wanted to go to a hospital, who might have wanted to stay in the comfort of their own home. And I chose this picture by R.H. Giles, which is undated, unfortunately, which is a bit earlier than the period we're looking at, but is, I still think, quite representative of what a lot of treatment would have been like, especially for the upper classes in this period. And what I like about it is it shows someone convalescing. So this was there was a great development in this period. Well, great development wasn't really a development. A very common prescription in this period was for bed rest or convalescing, especially if you were seen to be of a delicate disposition. So a lot of young women were assigned bed rest, by doctors and clinicians. And the other thing I like about this picture is it does show a nurse in the background with what looks like a meal. And again, whilst this was the great age of hospital building, many nurses in this period were still overwhelmingly concentrated in the home. So nurses who would make private home visits. And here I've got an example of a private nurse advertising her services in the Glasgow Herald around 1900. And you can see here, she's not one of those nurses who doesn't even hold a diploma or a university qualification. She does actually have formal training, and she's advertising her services here as looking after young children or an invalid. But again, this would have been an option that was relatively inaccessible for a lot of people, but at the same time, you would have had some poor law nurses who would have made home visits, sorry, and you would have occasionally also had health visitors who would have come and seen you at home. And I wanted to include this because I feel it's important to realise that, whilst folk medicine perhaps didn't have the prominence that it did in people's lives in the early modern period, it was still around, and people still had a knowledge of how to use their environment, and how to use the local landscape, especially in rural areas, to prepare medicines and various other treatments. I'm not sure if people are aware of this, but in the 1930s, I think a folklorist at the University of College Dublin, they assigned young school children the task of collecting folklore from their towns and villages, and quite a lot. And you can click on it here, and quite a lot of them are to do with like herbal medicine, so and folk medicine, and common cures for things. So it tends not for serious things; it tends to be for things. So here it's for warts. And if anyone ever is in County Mayo, the Museum of, I think, Rural Life, which is housed there, of Irish Rural Life, does a really spectacular job of showing how well into the 20th century, lots of people in the countryside were still very aware of how they could use their local environment, how they could use the local plant life and things like that to, treat themselves or their family members or their friends at home. And then there's the rise of patent medicine. So we have folk medicine, but we also increasingly get this commercialization of medicine and pharmaceutical goods. So as you can see here, but in 1905, there are over around 40,000 places that deal in patent medicines in this period. So places like pharmacies and so on, but also just specialist shops. And this this is a time of growth for the really big pharmaceutical companies. So some that are still around today. So Unilever, we also have Boots, obviously, for example. Ones that aren't around today, or at least not around as pharmaceutical companies necessarily, like Wellcome, Holloway, they have these big companies and people are making their millions, selling these medicines. And it's not just these big companies, you also get very small time patent medicine dealers. And often what they'll be doing is they'll be advertising these treatments that promise a lot. So even here with Angia's lung emulsion here, it is promising a lot. It's promising, to address every kind of instance of where someone has an irritation of the lungs, and um, is promising, treatment for things like not just like bronchitis, but it also sees here, you can see here it talks about the throat and lungs, but it also talks about the digestive organs, kidneys and bladder, general debility and wasting diseases. So this kind of approach to medicine, which was often called bottle doctoring, and I've made this point with you guys before, you can actually see how these companies are targeting very vulnerable sections of society. So people who might not have had recourse to, dispensaries or kind of drugs, essentially, and who would have been searching for something that was cost effective and covered a whole range of treatments. So that's something to consider in this period. We do really see this explosion in patent medicine. And this is something else I wanted to talk about. Like, as a historian of education, I felt like I had to include it. This is also the age where we're seeing the growth of the domestic science movement in schools. So this general fear that a lot of people had, that young girls in the closing decades of the 19th century were not being prepared to be good housewives, and so that the state had to step in. So this idea that the state needed to step in and train the housewives of the future to make a healthy, productive population. To make the soldiers and the workers of the future. So there was a lot in this curriculum that, for example, focused on like mothering and baby crafts. So, teaching young girls like about the importance of sterilizing bottles. But first aid was something else they taught as well. And we've got a thing here of a first aid lesson in a classroom, for example. And there are a number of books you could also buy in this period as a conscientious housewife or housewife to be on delivering first aid in the home. So I'm not sure how much spitting blood is now a common emergency, or drowning, but you can see actually at the bottom here, it's not just about emergencies. It's not just about delivering first aid. It's also about some common complaints like jaundice and diarrhea, for example. So it's not just about, how to how to dress a burn, there is a lot of emphasis on managing these common infectious diseases and kind of common ailments and complaints too. So women were sort of increasingly being taught to be in the household, the conscientious healthcare providers. Okay, so now I'm going to look at the hospital, and this is again a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the history of hospitals in this period. So I want to think a bit about the growth of hospital provision, and there are a number of laws and developments in this period that essentially enhance people's access to free or subsidized healthcare. So I mentioned at the start, from around 1845, it becomes compulsory to build county asylums. Then we have the Public Health Acts that begin in the 1870s, and kind of there's a number of them that kind of carry on well into the 1890s and early 20th centuries. And the most important developments for here is the building of isolation hospitals for infectious diseases like smallpox, for example. And then perhaps one of the most important developments, and this takes place 10 years after your pensioners retire, is the 1911 Insurance Act, which was a scheme brought in by the Liberal government by Lloyd George, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer. And this is basically a compulsory insurance scheme administered by the friendly societies that provided sickness benefit, disability benefit, medical treatment. So, you could go visit a GP, and admittance to a sanatorium in cases of TB. Now, whilst this might seem as this cartoon on the 1911 Insurance Act suggests, it might seem like it was, this incredible development, one that radically transformed the lives of everyone. There are a few caveats here. So, for example, for sanatoria, for example, there often was a massive shortage of beds, so people didn't necessarily, people who wanted treatment in a sanatorium for TB wouldn't have been able to access a bed. And also dependents were excluded, so wives and children were excluded from the Act. But I mean, it does show, so as I show here, local authorities are providing a sixth of hospital beds in England and Wales by 1911 and a third in Scotland. I can't find similar statistics for Ireland, I'm sorry to say. If someone finds something on the sort of impact of the 1911 Insurance Act on Irish hospital provision, please email me. I'd love to find out more. And so I'd struggled to edit this down to a slide because to talk about the growth of hospital treatment, and we talked last week about hospital medicine and diagnosis, to talk about all the different changes in sort of hospital therapy and hospital treatment that takes place in this period would take hours. And that it's a question of how long is a piece of string, essentially. So I thought I'd sort of list the main types of hospital treatment and also some new types of experimental therapies that are kind of going on in hospitals in this period as well. So surgery, so with the improvement of surgical hygiene from around the 1870s onwards, post-operative infection rates and survival rates improve. So surgeons basically have a greater and greater degree of confidence about operating on people in this period. And obviously, we have the development and refinement of various forms of anesthesia. So surgery does become more and more commonplace, and we get more and more surgeons too. So, the hospital was a natural location for surgery, for corrective surgery, so forth. Bed rests, so much like the convalescent we saw at home, hospitals were often places for bed rest and convalescing. And now I'm going to include some slightly kooky treatments that, well, not kooky, not all of them are kooky, but basically I want to show how this was a period of great experimentation in what the hospital could do. So we get light therapy. So this was forms of both natural and artificial sunlight to treat diseases like rickets or tuberculosis of the skin. We see radiotherapy, which we talked about it last week with X-rays, but it's also increasingly used to treat cancers as well. Massage for fractures, so nurses trained in medical massage, again, thinking more and more about post-operative health outcomes in this period. And then exercise cures, which I've worked a fair bit on. So these were in sanatoria exercise regimens for people who had pulmonary TB, and the idea was by doing exercise, medical exercise, you both helped boost the immune system and also strengthened, your lungs and the condition, your general kind of bodily condition as well. Yeah, so some of these treatments and approaches have survived. Some of them have not. So yes, we don't necessarily now encourage people with pulmonary TB to walk 5 miles a day or go digging trenches, for example. And we don't necessarily encourage people to go just sit outside if they have TB of the skin. And I thought I'd talk here briefly about mental health treatment, though it's slightly more difficult in this period. And again, the period we're looking at, the early 20th century, is a period of almost impossibly large and complicated series of changes in how people think about the brain and how people approach the treatment of the mentally unwell, with a certain Austrian man responsible for a lot of that. But I'd say, so the most important thing to take away from it is, from this slide, is the development of moral treatment from the mid-19th century onwards. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this image of Bedlam or Bethlehem Hospital in London in the 18th century. If anyone's seen the Rake's Progress in this period, it's perhaps the most famous representation of the treatment of what would have been called lunacy in this period. So treatment in some of these 18th century madhouses was very carceral and focused a lot around the use of physical restraints and physical punishment, for example. And increasingly from the mid-19th century onwards, there was a movement that increasingly identified that form of treatment as inhumane and proposed an alternative in the form of moral treatment. And this was something that really focused more on the importance of looking at routine, exercise, diet, and a reward and punishment system for the treatment of the mentally unwell. So the idea was you were making an appeal to the rational part of their brain, and that in itself would maybe help cure them or would help manage their condition. Even though it's a bit earlier, I'd recommend, if people are interested in thinking a bit more about moral treatment, The Madness of King George, the play, but also the film, which is excellent, has a very early example of sort of the proto-moral treatment in the case of King George as well. So I'd recommend a watch of that if you're interested. I'm not going to pretend it's a historical documentary, but if you're interested in sort of thinking about how the treatment of the mentally unwell sort of was slowly shifting, even though this is the early 19th century rather than the middle of the 19th century, it's still a very interesting watch. Anyway, other kinds of experimental treatments happening from the late 19th century onwards include hypnotism and psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis more in the early 20th century. I'm not going to go into these because it's a bit of a quagmire. But if people are interested and want to find out more, please do email me. I'm sure I have friends who work in this area, so I can hunt down things for you as well. And just to say, like, in terms of the sort of thinking about pharmaceuticals, there was some pharmaceutical treatments for insanity, but the first actually effective psychiatric drugs developed principally after the Second World War, so sort of beyond our period. Okay, so I thought we'd go into geriatric medicine, which I feel is very important, because a lot of your pensioners, I realise, on their death certificates have, old age or recorded as their cause of death. And I think there's a way in which this links back to the previous slide on mental illness, is there's a degree to which there's the late 19th and early 20th centuries are seen as this really, by a lot of people, as a time of great revolution in healthcare, including, I talked in the earlier slide about, these amazing pharmaceutical innovations and developments. But actually, if we look a bit at the history of geriatric medicine, it actually suggests more continuity than change. So it tended to, much like the moral treatment for the mentally ill, and obviously there was an overlap here, because there was a degree of recognition that the elderly had a number of neurological conditions and diseases of the brain. So treatment, much like the treatment for the moral treatment for the mentally unwell, tended to focus on stuff like regular habits, abstinence, diet routine, and managing the external environment. So it was really about managing symptoms rather than finding cures. Saying that, though, there was interest in geriatric medicine, and increasingly what you are seeing is a realization that old age is perhaps more a factor in someone's death rather than the principal cause. And I'm not saying that every doctor thought this, because obviously you guys see on your death certificates people who write old age simply as a cause of death. But there was a growing recognition amongst a certain caveat of medical practitioners, primarily based in America, but there are also some in Scotland, who were getting increasingly interested in the kind of what they saw as the natural degeneration of the elderly body, and were increasingly interested in studying things like, the heart of the elderly or the brains of the elderly. And there was also recognition that they had a number of comorbid conditions and illnesses as well. So their cause of death was often an escalation or a cascading of different conditions and causes rather than just old age. Okay, so this final part looks at the workplace. This is relatively brief because we covered some of this material on week 1. So one of the ways in which you could access healthcare in this period was also through friendly society and sick club doctors. As I mentioned in the previous slide, general practitioners could be involved in friendly society or club practice. And by 1900, around 2/3 of the urban population, it was estimated, had access to these kinds of services. I'm not saying that necessarily means they had access to premium kind of healthcare, or that, a lot of people would defer or drop out of these societies in times of scarcity. So, you might stop paying your dues to the sick club or the friendly society at points. So just because it says just because I wrote that they had access to these kinds of services doesn't necessarily mean they had a quality of access, or that the access was of particularly high quality even, and obviously here there's the obvious flip side, in that, in rural areas, your access to friendly society or sick clubs was much more circumscribed, because these societies and institutions tend to be concentrated in urban areas, and in these kind of industrial workplaces a lot of the time as well. So I thought I'd look at briefly at workplace health in the post office. So medical officers of health provided treatment for post office staff. They were established in around the middle of the 19th century, 1855, but with 1870 you get the nationalisation of the telegraphs, so you get a huge influx of new employees, and so as a result the medical service grows too. And just here you have a sense of the amount of medical officers of health that were dispersed across England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. And as you can see, as the size of the postal workforce grew, so did the amount of doctors employed by the post office. What kind of treatments did they provide for postal workers? So everyone had access to free treatment, free advice even, but it was only if you're earning under a certain amount of money, that under £150 a year, that you could access free treatment. Otherwise, you had to go to a private doctor. And this is a real case of also watch this space, because one of our PhD students, her PhD looks at, what kind of treatments were being prescribed for different conditions in the post office. So it's quite exciting, I guess, that, we don't know yet, and and that you guys are contributing to like this growing knowledge base. But I also understand it's frustrating that we can't tell you much yet about this. One example we did find, Holly Marley, our PhD student, alerted me to, was the use of sulfuric acid in orangeade to treat diarrhea and cholera amongst postmen. In an 1870 medical article. And I've got here an example of this formula, a formula for this, from the 1914 edition of Prescription Formulae for Use in Naval Hospitals. And I think, just sort of ad-libbing here, I think what's interesting about this is thinking about, from the perspective of the medical officers of health, how they had to find very cost-effective solutions for treating such a large number of workers, and how they weren't just thinking on the individual patient level, they were thinking in terms of these big swathes of workers. Pardon me. And so they had to find these cost-effective treatments. And I think what's interesting here is, as a historian, I'm thinking like, okay, why aren't they addressing the seasonal diarrhea? Why aren't they affecting the root cause? And it suggests a degree of expediency that I think maybe these medical officers of health had, of keeping the workers on their feet. And whilst I realise you guys are studying pensioners, I think it's still interesting to think about how they were treated by the medical service, and how maybe some common health complaints they had during their working lives probably maybe got swept under the carpet a bit, or were sort of dealt with in this very pragmatic way by the medical service, and thinking about what kind of effect that could have had on them in later life. So just kind of spitballing here, but I thought you'd like to know a bit more about the post office medical service, and a bit more about what sounds like a very uncomfortable and not very tasty use of a fizzy drink in 19th century medicine. Okay, so now we're going to look at tasks for this week. So the first task is using the resources in the syllabus, and also the resources we've looked in previous weeks, to determine where your pensioner might have been treated. So I'm quite interested in thinking about, looking at your death certificates and looking at the address recorded in there, thinking about, okay, so locally, where was the nearest hospital to your pensioner? But then also going a bit deeper, so thinking about what this place was like, what this hospital or asylum might have been like. So, how large was it? What kind of treatments did it use? How many people were treated there, for example? And also, would your pensioner have been able to have been treated there? Or did they offer free healthcare or subsidized healthcare? And there are three main, it's the same site, but there are three main ways of doing this. So I want you to start with the Historic Hospitals website. But I also want you to look at the additional resources and extra resources by area, because I have a lot there about other hospitals in those areas. So if you can't find something here, or if you want to look a bit further, please go look at that extra resources by area section on the syllabus. I'd also say going to the Medical Heritage Library and the Wellcome Library, if you're concentrating on this part of the question, so what was the place actually like? not just where was it and what was it called, but you're thinking about, what it might have been like to be in that space. Go to the Wellcome Library and the Medical Heritage Library, because they often have reports from these places, and these reports are full of information about, who is being treated, the kind of treatments they had, and silly things like, the Christmas party or something, which are really great bits of historical detail. Okay, so the second task, if you would like to do the second task, is again using the resources that you're all hopefully now quite familiar with. Try to determine what kind of treatments would have been available for your pensioner. So would they have been a candidate for surgical treatment, or would their conditions or illness have been treated pharmaceutically, for example, or a combination of both? Or thinking back to this idea of, geriatric medicine, and mental health conditions as well, thinking, was their disease or condition something that would have been managed in a different way? So would there have been a different kind of intervention, like, making sure they had a regular routine, or making sure they cut a certain thing out their diet, like they only ate plain food? Now I realize this is hard to do because we only have causes of death. So I do realize for those of you that this might be quite a tricky task to do. So don't necessarily overstress it if you're trying to wrap your brain around how to do it. Because I realize, again, some people have strange, quite sudden causes of death. Some people have much longer conditions that they suffered from. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to finish the last week of this mini course. It's been really fun recording these for you and revisiting a lot of old material. I hope you've enjoyed listening to them and that you've learned at least something, at least one thing. That's a plus in my book. So yeah, and as always, I look forward to really kind of getting into this with you in the discussion group. So thank you all